Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center, I would like to welcome you to today's Rocky Watch with UNH President Emeritus Mark Huddleston, who will be delivering the Perkins Bass Distinguished Lecture entitled The Burden of Student Debt. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom details. You can ask your questions at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A button. To access Zoom's closed captioning, navigate to the live transcript button and select Show Subtitles. If you don't see that option, it may be under the More button. Professor Huddleston has graphs to share tonight. When the screen share starts, I suggest you click on View Options at the top on the right and select Side by Side to see both Professor Huddleston and the slides. And you can change the size of the slides by grabbing the divider in between the two and dragging it to find the size that you'd like. I would like to introduce our student assistant, Shadi Mirvazan, who will be assisting us tonight with the question and answer portion of the evening. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Charles Whelan, Senior Lecturer and Policy Fellow at the Rockefeller Center, and the author of a recent memoir, We Came, We Saw, We Left, A Family Gap Year. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Joanne, and welcome tonight. It's my privilege to introduce Mark Huddleston. I know a lot of us feel like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel with regard to COVID and the pandemic, and we're hoping that life will get back to something approximating normal. And when we do get out of that tunnel, what we're going to discover is that before we arrived in the pandemic, we had lots of public policy challenges that we had neglected or not even taken on in the first place. It's kind of like we put out the dumpster fire and then we realized that we still have a leaky roof. One of those challenges is student debt and the related questions of the value that we're providing with higher education, the cost of higher education, and our strategies for ensuring that higher education is a tool to open up opportunities for students and not one that puts a millstone around their neck and forecloses options after they graduate from or don't graduate from an institution of higher education. Before I introduce Mark, I want to talk a little bit about the Perkins Bass Distinguished Visitorship. Mark is our distinguished visitor this year. The visitorship was named after longtime New Hampshire Congressman Perkins Bass, who was a member of the Dartmouth class of 1934. This appointment is meant to celebrate a New Hampshire citizen who's made an outstanding contribution in government and to give our visitors and our Dartmouth community an opportunity to share that knowledge in the Dartmouth environment. During the year, even in the time of COVID, our visitor, including Mr. Huddleston, is able to meet with faculty members, engage with students, visit classes, and of course, deliver the public lecture. After graduating from Dartmouth in 1934, Perkins Bass, who was a Republican, served as a New Hampshire state senator and a state representative. He was elected to 4 terms in the House of Representatives. He died in 2011 at the age of 99. He had been the oldest living former member of the U.S. House of Representatives. His son, Charlie Bass, class of 74, served 7 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. So this event is meant to recognize the service of Perkins Bass. Mark Huddleston was the president of the University of New Hampshire from 2007 to 2018. He is the longest serving president of UNH, and anybody who has even a passing familiarity with higher education administration knows what a Herculean accomplishment that is. He served in administrative capacities in higher ed before that at Ohio Wesleyan and at the University of Delaware. He was also a faculty member at the University of Delaware and at SUNY Buffalo. His academic training is in political science. He earned a master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now retired, Mark Huddleston describes himself as a good pilot and a bad golfer, which I suppose is much better than the other way around. So Mark, thank you very much for sharing your experiences with the community. Mark's going to talk for a while, present some slides, and then we'll come back and take questions. Shadi Mirvazan is going to be facilitating the Q&A. So thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody at the Rockefeller Center for making this possible. I look forward to talking to all of you and hearing what questions you may have later. Student debt, as Charlie indicated, is one of the hottest political topics in America these days, especially within the Democratic Party. There has been a lively discussion of what to do about it. Certainly since the 2020 primaries, we've been hearing a lot. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders both had proposals that they introduced then for doing away with all student debt. Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, more recently has been pressing for a $50,000 debt relief plan. The Biden administration has weighed in with a $10,000 relief plan, $10,000 per head relief plan. Haven't heard much from the Republicans on this score, but it is still an issue I think that will get a lot of discussion in DC in the days to come. My own position, which you will hear more about as we go along, is that America does indeed have a student debt problem, although it may not be exactly the one that the loudest voices have articulated. Patterns of debt are more complex, I think, than the simple aggregate statistics would have it. As a result, I think that the public policies that we design probably have to be more narrowly tailored than some of the most sweeping across the board options would have it. But before we get to policy options, we're going to talk a lot about the data. But before we get to the data, let me tell you a little bit about exactly how I want to proceed and what to expect. I really want to do a kind of three-part presentation. First, I will do a really broad 50,000-foot look at the data on student debt in America. Second, we'll dive a little bit deeper into it, look more granularly at exactly who has incurred what debt and exactly where the burdens lie. And finally, thirdly, I will try to take some stabs at some policy implications that fall out of this data. Before we start, just a couple of prefatory notes. First, as Joanne indicated, I'm going to be presenting some slides, and I apologize in advance. I'm not a big PowerPoint fan, but tonight I thought it was really essential given the fact this is such a data-infused issue. I thought there really was no way to proceed without a fair number of slides. Second, as I think Charlie or Joanne indicated, you can control, I understand, via Zoom how much of me you see and how much of slides you see. I would strongly suggest you see as little of me as possible and as much of the slides as possible, simply because, well, A, I'm not that much to look at, but B, the slides really are pretty dense, and the more of them you can see, the better. Third, however, that notwithstanding, I'm pretty sure that the Rockefeller Center will make this whole slide deck available. I really prepared it with the idea that it would be available to folks who want to look at the issue more carefully on their own. And therefore, you can not have to try to take furious notes about what I'm saying or write down what's on the slide. You should be able to get all that later. And final thing I want to say is that, as Charlie indicated, I'm a former college administrator. I'm not really an expert as a scholar in the area of student debt. I approach it with that hat on. All of the work that you'll hear from me tonight is really that of others that I have compiled. All of those references are in the slides, and you're free to look up the original published works. All the URLs are there from the data that I've gotten off the internet. So with that, let's go to the first slide, and we will see really what this commotion is all about, at least at the highest level of aggregation. This is a graph of how student loan debt in America has grown over the last couple of decades. And as you can see, it is a very steep slope indeed to that line, and it's undoubtedly the propellant that has fueled these policy proposals in recent years. And if we go to the next slide, we will see that student debt line is overshadowed or is nothing is greater than student debt, except for housing debt in America is a bigger burden. But with the next slide, we will see that compared to auto loans, credit card loans, virtually any other kind of consumer debt that Americans bear, student loan debt is outstripping all of them. Next is a little graph that gives us some glimpse into perhaps why this debt has grown as it has. We'll see that the number of student borrowers over the last 15 or 20 years has increased, although not nearly as quickly as the level of debt itself. And we'll talk more as we go along about why those lines don't track exactly. But for now, we'll just stipulate that at least part of the growth is a function of the increased number of borrowers, but clearly not all of it. The next slide, I think, gives us a little better insight into what's been fueling this increase in aggregate debt. This is a graph that many of you are probably familiar with. Sadly, it's one that I lived with every day as a college president. It's the cost of attending college over time. And it's also a very steeply rising curve, as anyone who's paid for a son or daughter to go to college in recent years knows. The light blue line is the average cost of tuition. The dark blue line is essentially the CPI, or what tuition would have been if it had been kept at the CPI. And clearly that is, at least in part, one of the reasons we've seen such a rising level of student debt. The next slide actually puts both of those functions on the same graph. It's the bar graph represents student loan debt over the last 20 years or so, actually over the decade of the teens. And the blue line is the public college tuition increase over that same period of time. Next slide, however, is a little bit of a complication in the thesis that the whole problem that we have with student debt in America is a function of rising college tuition. This is an interesting graph from the Brookings Institution, particularly from the work of Sandy Baum. And if anybody wants to pursue this issue of student debt, I would highly recommend Sandy's work. She has been at the forefront of college affordability studies over the last couple of decades, and anything that she writes is really worth looking at. And this graph comes from a study that she did, in particular, that compares how much debt is held by students who come from institutions where essentially their net tuition is zero, owing to perhaps scholarships that they get, or just low tuition institutions, versus institutions where net tuition is moderate, i.e. $1,000 to $5,000 a year, or $5,000 or more, which is the bar graph on the far right. And what you see is, in that set of graphs, that there's not a whole lot of difference in the amount of debt held by borrowers in the United States, despite differences in net tuition level. And we'll talk more about why that may be true later, but it's something just to kind of file away for now. And I think the take-home point of these last couple of slides is that the drivers of student debt are complicated. That there's no one factor that explains exactly why that slope has been rising at the rate that we've seen. On the next slide, and again, this part of the presentation is just sort of an orientation to the overall issue. I thought it would be helpful to show people who actually holds the debt that students have. And if we had been doing this talk 10 years ago, that graph would look very different. What it says now is that overwhelmingly the federal government is the entity that holds debt for students. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that pie chart would have been exactly the opposite, or the reverse, where it would be private lenders who held the overwhelming majority of student debt guaranteed by the federal government. But now, since the Obama administration in 2010 and their reforms, the federal government is a direct lender of most student debt. And that's an important point for a variety of reasons, but certainly in terms of the current debate and discussion about policy options, it has some moment, because it suggests that the federal government may be freer, the president indeed may be freer to provide debt relief than might have been the case had that debt been held mostly by private lenders. Although those of you who've been paying close attention to this know that even President Biden is a bit uncertain about what power he may have to to waive debt away. Next slide is another pie chart, but what it does is essentially take that federal lending and further subdivide it. And what it's showing us is that about 3/4 of all the outstanding debt now held by the federal government is a function of direct loans issued since 2010. The blue portions are, the dark blue portion is the kind of the holdover, the hangover from the pre-direct lending era. Loans still in the system that came from those earlier days of private loans backed by the federal government. And that little thin sliver of light blue are the old Perkins loans that no longer are being issued. They're still in the system. The slide after this is packs a lot of information, none of it terribly relevant for tonight, but I thought that anybody who might want to dive into this issue more deeply would appreciate having it here. What it does is array all of the loan collectors essentially down the left, that orange stripe down the left-hand side, all the entities that actually service federal student loans. And as you read across from each of those, you can determine where the loans are in the repayment cycle, how many of them are held, how many of them are now with students still in school, how many of them are in various grace periods, how many are being repaid, how many are being deferred, and so forth. It's sort of an interesting display of the data, so you have some idea of where that $1.7 trillion that we showed on the first slide is in the pipeline. Okay, that's kind of an overview of at a very high level of aggregation, as I indicated, of where we are with the student debt issue in America. If we go to the next set of slides, my point will be, as that phrase on the bottom there says, averages can be misleading. The debt crisis, such as it is not exactly what we may think it is. We need to look a little bit more precisely at who holds what debt, I think, to get a handle on that question. If you divide, if you kind of dial your memory back a few slides and you think about that $1.7 trillion in debt, and you notice the number of borrowers on the bottom of the screen, and you divided the first number by the second number, you would get the quotient that $40,000 on average is a debt load for American college students. But what we're going to learn in this section is that $40,000 figure isn't very helpful. I've often thought, as I've been going through this this work preparing for this talk tonight, how much fun it would be to be a statistics teacher or a methodology teacher maybe, and use this subject, because it really is a great illustration of how careful you have to be in looking at statistics to come away with conclusions that are really very helpful. So with that in mind, let's look at the next slide and begin to parse this a little bit more closely. And as I said, look a little more granularly at this debt problem. This slide takes all bachelor degree recipients for a single year, almost 10 years ago, and asks how much debt does each of them owe. And this slide is old, as I said, it's almost 10 years old, but actually the data haven't changed all that much in terms of the distribution, and it's nice and colorful and gives good insight, so I decided to use it. This too comes from Sandy Baum's work and Brookings. So what this is telling us, if you look at the top bar to start with, which makes a total of all bachelor degree recipients from all different kinds of institutions, public, private, for-profit, that 40% roughly, 30% of students owe no debt at all, and about 18% of students owe $40,000 or more. And that's an interesting finding in itself, because what it's telling us is that there are a lot of students who don't actually owe any money at all, and there are a few that owe a lot of money. The other takeaway for me from this slide is, and again, this speaks to the need to look at things in a more granular way, is that you get big differences between types of institutions. when you look at this tranche of the data. Public institutions, private institutions, nonprofit private institutions, and for-profit institutions have very different debt profiles for their graduates. Let's go to the next slide and look at this issue in a little bit more detail. This slide is not all students. It's looking just at those students who did borrow money of some sort to finance their education. And what this is telling us is that, again, 35% of all borrowers owe less than $10,000. And that 35% of borrowers constitutes less than 5% of the overall debt that is hanging out there. And by the same token, 6% of borrowers, if you add together the bottom two bars, 6% of all borrowers owe $100,000 or more, which constitutes roughly a third of all debt out there. Next slide, please. This, if that last slide was, I think it's probably the most insightful slide in the whole pack. This is probably the second most interesting slide on the deck in terms of the information that it gives us. What this slide is telling us, it's something very important that I don't think has made it into the headlines in most of this debate. And that is, if you look at associate degree holders versus bachelor degree holders versus graduate degree holders, the share of borrowers who are in the graduate degree camp is larger than one might have thought, A, and B, the amount of debt that they hold is very disproportionate to the number of borrowers in that category. Graduate students, in other words, borrow much more money than I think most people who follow the news on a regular basis would have guessed. And we're going to look at that issue in more detail going forward, including with the next slide, which gives us those nice line graphs that show over time, since 1970, as a matter of fact, how much undergraduates have borrowed versus how much graduate students have borrowed. Undergraduates are represented by that blue line. It's not quite flat, but it certainly doesn't rise at the same kind of slope as the red line, which are graduate students. Graduate students enroll roughly 15% of all students in higher education, but they now account for 40% of all federal student loans issued each year. Next slide looks at this a little bit more in even more precise detail, and we don't need to go into a lot of detail. It's there for you to look at if you like in the deck, but essentially it reinforces that point and it shows that graduate borrowing has in fact been growing at a much faster rate. And over this particular period of time, undergraduate borrowing actually declined by a not insignificant amount. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit more about race and ethnicity in a little bit, but this slide points out that amongst graduate students, that debt burden rests disproportionately on Black African-American students, and to some extent on Hispanic students as well. They borrow more money. They borrow money that is at both undergraduate levels and graduate levels disproportionate to their share of the student population. And it, as we will see in slides to come, means a much tougher time in the repayment phase of the loan cycle. Next slide, please. So graduate debt is a real problem, but it gets really kind of nasty when you look within the graduate cohort. We see in particular amongst professional graduate students that the debt load is really, really burdensome. Dental school leads the pack with an average debt of almost $300,000 for dental school graduates, running down through med students, vet students, pharmacy, and so forth, down to MBA students. It is a huge amount of money. The next slide will show the growth in med school borrowing over time from the late 1970s till now. It is just a huge increase. The slide after that shows borrowing amongst law school graduates. I find generally that they attract less sympathy than med students, but nonetheless, it is still a fairly steep slope to that line of borrowing by law students. Next slide shows a slice into the data by race. As I indicated, we need to talk about this a little bit more. The profile, at least if you look at all borrowing for white Caucasian students versus Hispanic Latino students, not too dissimilar, but there really is a fairly substantial difference when you look at Black and African American students who have a much more burdensome debt problem. In fact, the data that you will be able to find if you look at this website suggests that 4 years after graduation, almost half of Black students wind up owing 12.5% more than they actually borrowed as a result of accrued interest. It really is a very serious problem. Next slide provides a slice looking at income quintiles by borrowers. And what one finds when one does this is that the middle quintile of income amongst borrowers is about equal to their share of the population. In other words, they borrow about the same amount of money as they represent in the population of borrowers. But when you move to either end of the spectrum, you find that those percentages change dramatically. Wealthier families tend to borrow more money. Poorer families tend to borrow less money. That may seem counterintuitive on its face, but it isn't really when you think about it. Wealthier families are more likely to send their students to college, and wealthier families may even want to leverage relatively lower borrowing rates and take advantage of that. And that's interesting in and of itself, but it has some pretty serious implications when you think about ways to craft policy proposals to deal with debt problems. Let's go to the next slide. And just quickly, I know some people are probably interested in what exactly does it mean for American students? What does it mean on a monthly basis to have to make payments? This is a chart that tells you roughly what students are out of pocket for based on low end, median, high end borrowing for various degree levels. And I'll let you look at that at your leisure later on. And the slide after that is one that kind of expresses why it's so difficult for many students now, that 40% of them or more say that they are unable to afford, as a result of their payments every month, they would be unable to afford a $400 emergency. I think we're going to skip quickly through the next set of slides. Let's go just to the next one. I want to mention this because we're going to come back to it. And this is a graph that compares loan repayment rates across all institutions between two different groups, completers of college and non-completers of college. This is a really important issue. And as I said, we'll talk more about it. But what this slide in particular shows is that there's a vast difference between your ability to repay loans if on the one hand you've completed college, or on the other hand you have not completed college. And the next few slides, we'll just click through pretty quickly because we're running out of time, show what default rates are like based on whether or not you've completed college, what kind of institution you've attended, which is what this slide shows. The next slide shows default rates based on what kind of college you went to, how selective it was, and what major you chose. Both of those have a bearing on your ability to repay. And the slide after that shows what the default rates are like based on family background. Families with above median income and below median income have very different default rates, as one might expect. Okay, let's go next to what I make of this. Let me first say that everybody gets their data from the same place. The National Center for Education Statistics is the well from which almost everybody gathers their data. And I think it's important to note that well-intentioned, reasonable, smart people can look at the same data set and come to very different conclusions about what we ought to do to solve this problem. But since it's my turn tonight, I will give you what I think based on this data we ought to do. And I've got 7 different ideas I want to present. The next slide says that there really isn't any one single problem here, and there isn't any one single solution. What I mean by that is that the headlines that have driven this discussion, the $1.7 trillion in student debt, the $40,000 average per head debt, really are kind of misleading. As we've seen looking through these slides, the picture is much more complicated than that. And for me, the policy implication is that it would be a mistake simply to embrace a policy proposal that wipes out all student debt in America. It would be a mistake, I think, first, because it would be an incredibly expensive way to address a set of problems that might be more economically and efficaciously addressed in other kinds of ways. Second, well, actually, I'm still on the other slide, but my second point about why I think that would be an unwise idea, simply to wipe out all student debt with one sweep of the federal hand, is that people who embrace that policy assume, I think, either implicitly or explicitly, that higher education, which I think is a wonderful thing, is a pure public good. I think it certainly has great dimensions of public goodness, but it's not a pure public good. It still is the case that people who go to college earn on average more than $1 million more over the course of a life than people who don't go to college. And it strikes me that it is not inappropriate to ask people to make some investment in their own future, possibly by taking out some reasonable amount of loan to finance their own education. Another reason, this is third, not skipping to another slide, but another reason why I think it would be inappropriate to simply in one move wipe out all student debt is that would be essentially a very regressive public policy. In fact, if you go back and you look at the Sanders-Warren proposals of the primaries, you would wind up, if you followed that path, finding that 65% of the benefits would flow to the top 40% of all households in terms of income. And the bottom 40% of households would receive approximately 14% of the benefits, which just does not seem to me a very balanced or wise policy. Let's go to the next slide. That said, I think we clearly do have a set of problems with student debt in America. And one of those is with for-profit institutions. They are the most expensive, and they are the least effective institutions of higher education that we have. They unfairly target first-generation and minority students. They saddle them with debt, and they either wave goodbye before a degree is granted, or they tend to provide credentials that have very little value in the marketplace. Education Secretary DeVos in the last administration undid a lot of things that the Obama administration had done in this area, suspending the gainful employment rule, amending the 90-10 rule, which said that institutions that wanted to receive Title IV funds had to show that they got something more than 90% of they couldn't get more than 90% of the revenue from Title IV funds. I think we need to reinstate those rules, probably make them considerably stronger. I have some optimism that the Biden administration may do those kinds of things, and we can talk more about that if you like in the Q&A. Next slide. We also have a problem, it is clear to me, with respect to graduate study in the United States. Far be it from me to say that a master's or a PhD is not a wise investment. It often can be, and I'm certainly glad that I made that investment myself. But I think too often students are led to enroll, they're encouraged to enroll by institutions in postgraduate programs that are often unlikely to pay off, certainly in any economic sense. Even if they do pay off, maybe in some other kinds of senses, they saddle students with debt that they are not going to be able to discharge given employment prospects. I think it's worth considering some kind of gainful employment rule for Title IV lending to not even for-profit institution, all institutions, if they have a huge number of graduate degrees that don't lead anywhere. And I know that in the days since the defunding of public institutions in particular, a lot of high-quality public institutions have looked to master's programs in particular to generate income without necessarily ensuring that those degrees are going to lead the students who enroll them to meaningful careers. So that's a problem. Fourth slide, please. There we go. I think we have an even bigger problem with professional graduate education. And I don't know how anyone can look at that set of slides on medical education and dental education in particular and not conclude the same. If we saddle doctors and dentists with those kinds of burdensome debt levels, we should not be surprised when they specialize in areas and gravitate geographically to areas that allow them to repay those burdensome debts and lead us to have deserts in America of medical professionals and dental professionals and fellow Americans who simply aren't able to access those services. It would seem to me to make much more sense, public policy sense, to subsidize education in those areas and look for ways to have people who get those degrees pay us back collectively by serving in areas where they need to serve. If we look across the border to Canada, the debt for professional graduate education averages out in medicine to be around $20,000 a year rather than $200,000 a year. I think we could learn a lesson from them in that regard. Next slide, please. The indebtedness of college graduates is a problem, but those who don't graduate are an even bigger problem. And what I mean by that is pretty obvious, I think. The completion rates in America for college, for undergraduate school, are really pretty appalling. 61% graduation, 6-year completion rates, graduation rates at public institutions, 67% 6-year graduation rates at private nonprofit institutions, 25% at for-profit institutions. That means that there's an astonishing 75% of kids who come out of as dropouts of those for-profit institutions who do not have degrees, 39% from public institutions, and 33% even from private nonprofits. That's a huge number of students who have incurred burdensome loans that really have no meaningful way of earning the money to pay them back. And I think we need to address that. Fixing it is not going to be easy. I don't think there's any one sexy federal program like debt abolition that will address it, but I think that higher ed institutions need to have a bigger stake in college completion. And right now, they really don't, unless you're a public institution in a state that has some kind of performance funding formula, and there aren't many of those really. But if there were some kind of a federal rule that said that Title IV funds were tied to some level of completion rate, it might help us tackle that problem. Next slide. This is probably a controversial argument, but I'll say it anyway. I think some students accumulate debt by picking the wrong college. It is possible with Pell Grants and with modest borrowing or even no borrowing to go to public institutions and graduate and not have a huge amount of debt as a millstone, as Charlie put it, around your neck. Students don't always make wise choices. There was an appalling article, really, in Inside Higher Ed a couple of weeks ago I read, where a young man in New Jersey wound up, between he and his mother, borrowing something like $150,000 a year to get a degree across the river at Temple University in a major that he could have gotten at Rutgers or another New Jersey institution virtually for free. And I found him relatively representative of a lot of students that I have known who have decided to cross state bounds and go from one to another to a public institution and pay out of state rates and wind up having to borrow heavily to do it. And frankly, those of us from public institutions are responsible for that to a considerable extent. I can attest personally that with the defunding of public higher education, we in that sector had to scramble to try to find full tuition paying out-of-state students to subsidize in-state students. And it's a travesty and one we ought to try to undo, but it is a reality. And we should do everything we can, I think, to encourage students to make sensible college choices. Finally, and this is really obvious, but I'll say it anyway, solving the college debt crisis is one thing, but it really is inseparable from solving the overall college affordability crisis. Every time I hear a politician say we ought to wipe out college debt, I think, great, but what happens the day after tomorrow when the student decides, next year's student decides that he or she is going to go to college and has to borrow money to do that? I find it unconvincing when those same politicians simply say we'll make college free, partly because I just don't think that's going to happen in a matter of a couple of weeks, and really more because I think it's a far more complicated set of policy propositions even than solving the debt crisis. And I just don't think we can address one without addressing the other. I've talked far too long, and I apologize. I've given you far too many slides, but I'm going to call a halt there and make time for you to launch some questions.
Terrific. So before Shadi begins fielding questions, I'm going to ask the first. Mark, why do you think that the for-profit institutions have gone so far off the rails? I'm not a free market zealot, but if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have thought there was great potential here. The community colleges were sclerotic in terms of matching graduates to jobs. And certainly where I come from in Chicago, there was a pretty good model in DeVry in terms of having a 99% placement rate. So the model itself doesn't seem like it should be broken. If anything, it might be able to, it should in theory be able to improve on a very slow moving public model. So what's gone wrong there?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think you're right, Charlie. I'm not a free market zealot either, although I do believe in markets, and I would have expected them to work better than they do. But I think what we've got here is not a case of free private markets operating exactly. You've had heavily subsidized students through the loan system being sucked into that by, I think, often false promises. I mean, Trump University is an obvious extreme example, but where students who really don't have at-home guidance from parents who've been to college to help steer them on a better course are made, given assurances, made promises, and are told that they can take out loans very easily, and they do. And when you see 90% or more of the revenues of these institutions coming from Title IV funds, I think really have the answer to that question. It's a setup. It's a way to siphon money from the public treasury into these often fly-by-night kinds of operations that benefit private owners. Kevin Carey, who was, I think, a well-known higher ed expert, he's in the press a lot, had a great piece in the Times last year where he did a piece on this, and he spotlighted the Academy for the Arts. Anybody who's ever been to San Francisco, downtown San Francisco, has seen those banners hanging from like 30 or 40 buildings around downtown. And it is just appalling the amount of money that kids pay through these loans to get degrees that are fundamentally worthless because they're charmed by recruiters at those institutions. And until we had those Obama era rules, there were virtually no checkpoints. There were no barriers to that happening.
Terrific. I'm going to turn over to Shadi, who's fielding questions. If you haven't asked a question already, please do. We've got a long list here. So Shadi, please take it away.
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A whenever you feel. We have about 15-ish minutes, so if you get it in before then, that would be awesome.
Yeah, sorry.
Our first question is, does the data that you've been showing here so far include parental loans, like loans maybe parents taking out in other ways privately to avoid federal student loans?
Yeah, most of the data that I presented did include the so-called Parent Plus loans. If that's what you mean by parent loans, I'm sure some parents that directly loan money to their students. But if you mean loans that parents have taken out through the federal government, yes, that data is rolled up in here.
All right, great. And then Anna asks, what are Title IV funds?
Yeah, Title IV is the general federal piece of the Higher Ed Act that governs how federal lending and a variety of other federal financial aid programs are structured. So
Great.
in particular, what I'm talking about are the direct loans that are made now by the Department of Education under the authority of Title IV.
Awesome, thank you. So Bill asks, there are a lot of groups that are dealing with high debt, African Americans, the impoverished, graduate students, students who attend for-profit institutions, as we just discussed. How much overlap is there between all of these categories of people with high debt?
Well, there's some overlap, obviously. At least in some of those slides I whipped through, you could see there was overlap amongst minority students and students from relatively disenfranchised backgrounds in the lower income quintile. But there's not perfect overlap, obviously, that those who go to professional school and get MDs or doctors of dentistry tend disproportionately not to be from those same disadvantaged groups typically. And they're disadvantaged by debt, but disadvantaged for different reasons. So some overlap, but not complete.
Great, thank you. So Anna asks again, why are college costs so out of control for the last 40 plus years? Does the availability of federally guaranteed debt add to the ability to inflate tuition so rapidly?
Yeah, that is worth not just another hour by itself, probably a whole semester by it. I would urge Charlie to teach a course and put it online and have people talk about that for over a period of weeks. It's complicated. There are some people who believe that it is actually the availability of cheap federal money that helps fuel the cost of higher ed. I think there is maybe a kernel of truth in that. I don't think it's the whole story by any means. I'm much more persuaded by the argument that higher ed is very much like other highly specialized labor-intensive industries that are not able to take advantage of all the revolutions in information technology and other ways to increase efficiencies. But again, it's a really complicated question. It's one I struggled with every day as a college administrator. Never had a very satisfactory answer to it.
Thanks. William asks, what I guess why is the policy option of reducing interest rates on outstanding debt not being considered? I guess to what extent, what is the role of lowering or increasing interest rates in this kind of larger debt scheme?
Yeah, well, I think that some of the most aggressive proponents of debt relief would say that's not enough. I can't speak for them because, as I've already said, I don't completely embrace that proposal. I think that perhaps a more modest approach to debt relief could look at that as a piece of the puzzle, although interest rates are really not that big of the part of the problem, I don't think. It really is the principle that's weighing on folks, and reducing interest rates would help a little bit. And there are vehicles within Department of Education programs now to consolidate loans and to stretch loans out. So I really don't think that interest rates alone, addressing interest rates, would change much for folks.
That's a great point. Peter asks, how large is the student default?
Well, the slides that I went through really quickly went into that in some detail. And what one finds is that default rates vary considerably depending on the kind of institution one attended. They vary depending on whether one got a degree or didn't get a degree. They vary on family background. Students who have loans from relatively wealthier families, not surprisingly, default less frequently. Students from STEM majors tend to default less often than students from arts and humanity majors. It really depends. There's a lot of different factors that go into default rates.
That's a great point. Hunt asks, do you think that online colleges are part of the solution or some other, I guess, cheaper, less costly form of education?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about that for years, and I think that this pandemic experience that we've all had with Zoom will probably accelerate that that discussion. I think it will play a role. I don't think it will be nearly as transformative as a lot imagined at the dawn of the online education age. I think it'll be more just an element in trying to control costs rather than a real solution to the problem.
Thank you. And then let's see. So Tucker asks, how do you see the kind of debt relief proposal, like the 10,000, 50,000 one proposed by the current administration, impacting long-term enrollment trends? Are these proposals just a confidence bailout for higher education to bounce back from the pandemic?
That's a really good question, and I don't think it's one that people have thought very much about. I think that the $10,000 relief proposal is a good idea. That if it were targeted at those students most in need, I think it makes sense. It's relatively tailored and strategic. I also think that the Biden administration appears to be thinking actively about next steps so that it will not be just a one and done. And as I indicated, I don't think that we can afford a one and done approach to debt relief. But if I take the meaning of the question correctly, it's interesting to speculate on what will be in the heads of that next class of students who enrolls in school, knowing that there had been $10,000 debt relief for their older brothers and sisters. How will that affect their decision to enroll? How will it affect the way higher ed institutions address their students who are entering classes, how they structure their financial aid packages and so forth? I don't know. But that's a really interesting tangle of issues.
Excellent. Jared also asked an interesting question. How would you feel about programs such as the one from University of Maine, where they match the tuition that out-of-state students would pay in their home state? Is that kind of sustainable in the long run?
No, I don't think it is. I think it was a clever marketing ploy by the University of Maine to deal with demographics that are even worse than New Hampshire and Vermont's. I remember the first time I saw that initiative, I was on I-95 driving through Maryland, I think, and there was a big billboard on the side of the highway. It was arresting, got my attention. It may get some people to think about it, but it was not sustainable for Maine. I mean, it was not. It was a cost to them that I think they wrote off as a marketing expense, and it's no real solution to the problem.
Great, thank you. Another really good question. Thank you all for these really interesting questions. How do you feel about the current efforts of better endowed colleges and universities to eliminate loans and replace them with grants for families with income under $100,000 or $200,000? And do you think perhaps maybe adding on to that colleges with large endowments could be doing more regarding that kind of plan?
No question. I applaud those that are doing it. I would encourage those who aren't doing it to consider doing it. Not only is it the right thing to do, in my view, for students, I also think it's the right thing to do for those institutions. We know that well-endowed institutions have come under pressure from the feds. They're likely to come under further pressure from the feds. I think to the extent that they're seen doing the right thing on their own, they'll be able to blunt some of that pressure. But no, I think it's a really important initiative.
Excellent. We'll ask maybe 2 to 3 more questions. Thanks everyone for asking them. Let's see. Kind of based on our conversation before about the relationship between Canadian graduate debt and American graduate debt, how does the loan debt for undergraduate and graduate students in the US compare to loan debt in other countries, particularly in the scope of employability once the degree is earned?
I'm so glad you asked that. I was blowing through those slides so fast, trying to stay within my time. I forgot to mention a couple of things. Interestingly, if you compare average debt in America to debt in other developed countries like the UK and Sweden and Germany and Canada, at the undergraduate level, they're not all that different. And it's kind of surprising in some ways, but it actually goes back because a lot of those institutions, or a lot of institutions in those countries have lower levels of tuition. Not so much in the UK, but certainly in Canada and Germany and elsewhere. But it leads one to ask the question, why would there be similar levels of debt? And it goes back to that slide I think I introduced from the Brookings Institution that talked about relative debt amongst, for students who went to low net tuition institutions and high net tuition institutions. And Sandy Baum's point in preparing that slide in the first place was that a lot of students borrow not to pay tuition, but to pay living expenses. And it's actually why borrowing costs are so much higher for relatively disadvantaged demographics in the United States, because they have such a hard time scraping together money just to live on. And I think it goes to explain why students in Canada and Sweden and elsewhere borrow just about as much as American students, because they may get tuition relief, but they don't necessarily get relief for living expenses. And I think that if we want to try to address the college affordability crisis and the debt crisis long term in the US, we're going to have to get serious about raising Pell Grant levels and otherwise provide for more subventions for living as well as for tuition.
Great. So we have time for one more question, I believe. So Daniel, have you observed any relationship between kind of geography and the amount of student debt? So are students from urban areas more or less likely to have debt compared to students from rural areas?
Yeah, I know there is data out there. I've actually seen state by state data. I'm sorry I didn't put one of those slides in because it was already pretty thick. And I don't remember off the top of my head. I know that there is some variation. It's not extreme, but there is some variation out there. Certainly, a state like Wyoming, where it's almost free to go to the public institution, you're going to see lower levels of debt than you are in New Hampshire, where it's very expensive even to go to public institutions. So yes, there is variability, but I can't give you exact statistics off the top of my head. And I would conclude with one more point, if I could, Shouty, and that is I hope that I leave people with the impression that this is a problem that we need to solve nationally with federal intervention, but it's also a problem I want to make sure I leave people with understanding that I think higher ed institutions need to have a direct role in. I think it would be a mistake if the federal government were simply to start writing more checks to institutions of higher ed without getting something in return, because I think that higher ed has a responsibility to help control the costs, as we've already discussed, and to help solve the debt problem.
Well, thank you so much. And you ended right at 6 o'clock. Good job. I want to thank Professor Huddleston and Professor Whelan and Shadi for hosting this eye-opening and troubling discussions. There's certainly a lot of factors that go into this. If you would like a copy of the slideshow, please email rockefeller.center@dartmouth.edu, and we will send you a copy of the slideshow so you can take your time to look at the graphs. I want to thank everybody for attending. Please join us tomorrow night at 7 o'clock when Rockefeller Center Director Jason Barabas hosts two Tuck professors, Peter Fisher and Kurt Welling, who will be discussing GameStop, Robinhood, and Reddit. Thank you very much for attending tonight. Thank you all.